Philippines are guised as civil society groups. So they might, an illustration of that is that they might be stationed actually at schools, at hospitals, where public services are supposed to be implemented for the communities there. And in the name of, you know, bringing on healthcare or health services, you see now more and more these public entities being controlled by military instead. I just wanted to talk a little bit about also, since Obama's administration and the continuing forces in the Philippines, there are two particular policies. The Enhanced Defense Cooperative Agreement that was recently passed under Obama's administration in 2014, and the Visiting Forces Agreement that started in the 1990s, but was also revisited and passed recently. So with Obama's administration, the Enhanced Defense Cooperative Agreement actually now allows US military bases to expand in the Philippines, but now without paying rent and without having any checks and balances in terms of environmental plunder. So any of the destructive, toxic waste that US bases deploy in the Philippines, now they've washed their hands on being accountable for that type of destruction. And with the Enhanced Defense Cooperative Agreement and visiting forces, we also saw early in October 2014 the death of trans woman Jennifer Laude, because we also see that different areas where US militarization is, relaxation and recreation for troops still continues. So that's also definitely one of the impacts that we've seen with US intervention. And I think that's just kind of, I just wanted to describe what we meant by the policies that we see in US imperialism using in our countries, but also what we see when those policies are implemented is really the devastation and plunder of not just our natural resources, but also the communities and the human rights abuses that continue to penetrate, and people keep on being attacked and neglected because of imperialism in our home countries.
So one of the things I also wanted to ask everybody up here is that we're talking about the violence that's happening within home countries, but we also have folks in the diaspora, migrants, right, forced migration, people here who are also experiencing very similar forms of violence. So we talk about torture, talked about, you know, extrajudicial killings. So for example, for Muslims here, that's all happening. Even the kind of policing that we see within the community, there's no such thing as local law enforcement, is actually the FBI that's surveilling and mapping you. And so with that, I want to ask all of you about how does this violence that we see in home countries is also happening right here to communities that come from sort of these places.
Thanks, Allie. So this is, you know, a pretty big question and something I wrote my PhD dissertation on. So I have a lot of answers to that. But, you know, when you start to map out some of the policies, right, that have been designed and implemented post 9/11. When I started to do that, you know, it became clear to me that there was a strategy of first targeting non-citizens, right? And that was to sort of bring the war on terror home, but kind of keep it a little bit removed in terms of who was being targeted, right? This was especially useful for Muslims domestically, so they understood the conflict as, this is for non-citizens. This will not affect you because you are American citizens. You are as American as any other American. However, as the years went by, the policies that were designed and implemented increasingly targeted the Muslim community. For example, one of the most striking things that has happened is the extrajudicial assassination of Anwar al-Awlaki, which was huge, right? Because he was assassinated without any sort of due process, and most importantly, he was an American citizen. So this was one of the moments where Muslims in America, and particularly those with citizenship had to think to themselves, am I safe as an American citizen? And clearly the answer was no, because their Muslim identity trumped any national citizenship that they held in this country. The US government has implemented a vast series of policies. So, for example, the FBI has surveilled numerous communities and mosques. And these are some of the more benign things they've done, in that with FBI surveillance, sometimes people choose to still attend the mosque, because why should that right be taken away from them? And some just choose not to go to the mosque. There may not actually be any direct consequences in terms of being, detained or tortured or anything like that, but there's sort of a range, right? So then we have Muslims, right, who have been preemptively prosecuted and who have been entrapped. This has been a huge problem in the Muslim community, where not only is the FBI employing very questionable tactics and wasting taxpayer dollars, most of the individuals that they have detained have only admitted to or confessed to wanting to commit a crime after significant probing by the FBI. If you're interested more in this issue, I would suggest watching a documentary called Terror, which is about precisely this, an FBI informant who's being filmed to undertake his whatever assignment is what they call it, and the person who's being surveilled, right? And in the end, the person who's being surveilled is detained, but not because of a terrorism charge, because of a previous weapons offense. So this is the ways that the US government is choosing to target the Muslim community. I unfortunately had a discussion with someone who's a former FBI agent, and he was trying to tell me that I shouldn't be that concerned about what the FBI has done because, they can't possibly target all of us. They have limited staff. And I said, wow, that's really comforting. But the point is really in the employment of these policies, the idea is to target a handful, and the efficiency of the policy then becomes, we target a handful of you to scare the rest of you into not doing whatever it is that you were doing, even if it just means donating to a charity. I know numerous people at this point that will not write a check to a Muslim organization. They simply will not do it. It's only cash. They don't want any trail, they don't want any problems. And this is a significant fear. So even the very sort of mundane things that Muslims are doing is being policed by the US government. Now when we move on to other more serious violations, particularly concerning detention, a friend of mine who's actually now the director of the Prisoners and Families Committee of my organization, he has a long sordid story. He was basically tortured into confessing to kill President Bush, is now in detention for life because they allowed a tortured confession into the charges he got, into the sentencing he had received. He initially received 30 years, but the government appealed for a higher sentence because they didn't think that was enough. And so now he has life in prison. He's been held in solitary confinement. He's been tortured. I mean, everything possible you can imagine. And again, he is actually an American citizen. He actually went to the mosque in Falls Church, Virginia. So for that community, it's especially fearsome, right? Because one of their own community members was taken away from them. And that mosque, actually, from what I know, I've never been there at the Friday prayer, but they frequently say hello to the FBI informants at the Friday prayer because they know that they are consistently there. I want to talk about Guantanamo Bay a little. Can I do that now? Okay. So I actually think in terms of, obviously this is semi-domestically, but not domestically in the sense that the US government is, decided intentionally and strategically to imprison the prisoners of Guantanamo Bay on an offshore prison instead of housing them domestically. So from the get-go, the idea was to evade the law. I'm not sure entirely why that was necessary, considering they then created law to sanction their behaviors, but for whatever it was worth, they decided they needed to evade the law somehow. And for those of you who don't know much about the history of Guantanamo Bay, Guantanamo Bay is actually leased to the U.S. Government, right? This is back from the early 1900s under the Platt Amendment, which was later annulled, and then another agreement came saying that the U.S. government had control over Guantanamo Bay as a naval station, not as a prison, as a naval station, naval and coaling station. So to me, this actually kind of represents the nexus of both worlds, Latin America and the war on terror. So this didn't happen, you know, with the context of the war on drugs, but it is Guantanamo Bay being colonized by the U.S. government to then house an exclusively male Muslim population. So I think that that's a really, really critical statement. It's colonization, it's dehumanization, and it's at its worst. The torture tactics that have been used there, if I'm sure many of you have heard, solitary confinement, being trapped in boxes with insects, being made to hear loud music, being forced to, you know, wear goggles, putting a black bag over their heads, desecrating the Quran. The list goes on and on and on. And so when we think about Guantanamo Bay in terms of the establishment and also the context and the treatment, to me that also set a precedent for, you know, capturing what it was that the American population should learn to believe and re-believe, because Islamophobia is not necessarily a new phenomenon, it re-emerged, about the Muslim population. So in my mind and in my research, you know, Guantanamo Bay kind of set the stage for the way in which people would then perceive the entire population of Muslims, so that it would be easier to inflict problematic and egregious policies not only on an international population of Muslims, but domestically as well.
And also that you're alluding to also something that kind of also, you know, brings together like Latin America and the Philippines. You know, the U.S. 1898 was a year where they, you know, kind of took a bunch of Spain's colonies, including Cuba, and that's why they still have, you know, there's still Guantanamo, including the Philippines and including Puerto Rico, which, you know, continues to be a U.S. colony straight away, and you know, perhaps my friends in the front row can discuss that a little bit more during the Q&A, but given also the continued crisis there that's been in the news to a degree. But as far as how imperialism manifests itself here domestically, I think that for one, you know, when we talk about all the money that's spent on militarization and basically by the Pentagon, right? The Pentagon takes up what 50% of the discretionary budget. You know, so in Mexico, $3 billion since 2008 on militarization. In Central America, another $1.5 million since 2008, $1.5 billion. So this money is basically just going to destroy these countries or destroy these societies, destroy the social fabric for the benefit of the oligarchies and multinationals in the Pentagon. Honduras has, there was a 2009 coup in Honduras, and that has unleashed that's one of the reasons why it's completely horrible, and people are fleeing, along with escalation of the drug war. We have a criminal regime in place, and the U.S. has built, you know, 5 or 6 new military bases in Honduras since that time. It expanded upon the huge one that they already had there. And the reason why I'm saying how that affects us domestically is because obviously we're spending all of that, when all our tax money is going into these things, then you know, that's why we have, you know, horrible, you know, increasingly horrible education system. You know, Obamacare is supposed to be this huge reform for a lot of people, but obviously it's still a waste of money, and we don't have adequate, you know, the healthcare system that we should for being a developed country, a Western country, infrastructure, all the things that are the trade-offs to maintaining an empire, maintaining military bases abroad. I mean, that has to be seen as something that affects all of us. That would be one. I think also immigration is something that should be seen that affects everybody. You know, whether you're, you know, an immigrant yourself or not, given that all these people you know, are coming into these communities throughout the U.S. and you know, obviously, you know, you know, immigrants provide a lot of things, you know, a lot of, you know, positive things, but it's also utilized as a way to divide communities, pit black versus brown, and also, you know, and allow people to have that scapegoat instead of, you know, looking at the real problem, which is, you know, the rule by, you know, an oligarchy here, as well, since you know, we also don't really live in a democracy here either. And further proof of that is that, you know, empire is a bipartisan venture. I was struck by also how some of the plans that Joe discussed about the Philippines were under Bush, but they've obviously been continued under Obama, and that's really the same thing in Latin America as well. With the drug war, the escalation of the drug war was, in a sense, a Bush plan, but you know, Obama has definitely continued to escalate it, and to disastrous consequences, making people flee. And it's really not that simple, different from the 80s, is the way that I see it, from, you know, these conflicts that are more well known, people coming from El Salvador, being one of those people of the Salvadoran diaspora that's here. My colleagues are here from Guatemala and Colombia. You know, so there's so many people, so we're part of that that consequence. You know, there's the book Harvest of Empire that talks about it. It's all right, but the documentaries, it's all right. I definitely do recommend it, but it's with caveat on Nicaragua and Cuba. But and I think another way that it really also increasingly affects us here is through, you know, the tactics abroad being used inside now. Police militarization, the increase in the budget for, you know, DHS being militarized further. You know, the tactics used against, you know, definitely in particular Muslim communities, the repression, you know, of black communities after the protests, after the uprisings in Ferguson and Baltimore, those things, you know, they're going to continue to increase here, and obviously the rest of the world has been, you know, a laboratory where the U.S. also tries one thing and then exports it to another part of the world, and then figures out what works and what doesn't, and then does it somewhere else. But that's also good, you know, obviously has been increasingly happening here, and you know, I think as you know, the crisis of the failure of capitalism continues, you know, I think that we'll continue to see even more of that, and also I mean, I 1 minute, I really truly believe that also it's going to be difficult to you know, rid ourselves of all the scourges of racism and the legacy of genocide and slavery and the continued racism that, you know, are the history of this country, without you know, also addressing imperialism and the freedom of other people, and destroying that you know, the fallacy of white supremacy that helps uphold them both.
So I think in terms of seeing how imperialism and its impacts on the Filipino community domestically here in the US and possibly around the world, anywhere where Filipinos are outside of the country, particularly we see that migration is not a choice for a lot of our communities. For the immigrant community, it's mostly you know, a need to survive. So there are different aspects of desperation and being unable to sustain livelihood for yourself and for your family back home. And just to give a little bit more about information about the immigrant community here in the United States, or basically we say overseas Filipino workers abroad. Approximately 6,000 leave the Philippines each day. As I spoke before, there's no real national industry in the Philippines, but one of the best industries in the Philippines is the export of our own people. So the export of labor. Particularly, and that's 60% of that are Filipino women. So in 2010 and 12, it was 4,500 leaving each day. So it's definitely, we've seen a definite increase, but we've also seen that what are the particular, I guess, jobs or positions that our community finds themselves in are we call dirty and dangerous jobs. They're basically the jobs that people won't do. And they're being not just low-wage workers, but also involuntary servitude. And the best type of example I can probably give you is our own campaign here in DC, where approximately we've reached out to 150 traffic teachers, and that they comprise of our membership. They were lured by under one recruiter using different type of recruiting agencies in the Philippines, and particularly preying on women. Because you know, the role of women in the Philippines is really to be the provider, to take care of the family, and as they mostly comprise the teaching roles in the Philippines. So with the forced migration, we just see escalation of attacks on women's rights, economic rights, human rights, and particularly in trafficking. It's something that we see our communities facing every day. And it's not just through these different professions, but also through domestic work. So we have Filipino women working as nannies, as caregivers, and usually that's under the table. There is no type of security. It can be around-the-clock work, 24 hours a day. And I just wanted to share a little bit of a case that we were actually working on recently, because we have a contact with ICE there to kind of help with the paperwork in trying to find immigration relief for our trafficked teachers. A woman from a northern Cotabato city in Mindanao was recently was trafficked to the United States, to Fairfax, Virginia. Her employer had trafficked her here, and one of the reasons why she said that she had to leave the Philippines is because there's consistent bombing in her home community. So we see it's really direct and intense in terms of US imperialism and militarization in the country, impacting forced migration, not only just forced migration of professionals, such as teachers or government workers, but really people from the indigenous community to the Muslim community, and people in the urban sectors. So when we see the penetration of our country being harmed there, we also see their human rights, their rights being attacked and neglected here in the host country or wherever they find themselves. And the Philippines, ironically enough,